What if the man everyone stepped over, the man dripping wet in the storm with nothing but a broom in his hand, turned out to be the one holding the keys to a fortune? On a night when thunder split the skies and neon lights flickered against broken windows, a black janitor stood shivering, cast out by an arrogant landlord who saw him as nothing more than dirt. But beneath the rain-soaked jacket and calloused hands was a truth that would unravel pride, prejudice, and power itself. The night was a cathedral of storms. Rain hammered the streets like 1,000 unrelenting fists, each drop exploding against asphalt already slick with sorrow. Neon signs flickered and hissed, their electric glow fighting against the darkness, while thunder rolled across the skyline like an angry god. The city seemed alive, restless, unforgiving, a place where stories drowned before they could be told. On the corner of Ashwood Avenue, under the shadow of a building that towered like a monument to wealth, stood Elijah Turner. His frame was thin, slightly stooped, but his presence was heavier than the storm. A cardboard box trembled in his arms, sagging under the weight of sodden papers, a faded photograph, and the relics of a life lived in silence. His work uniform, a janitor's blue shirt now darkened by rain, clung to him like a second skin, suffocating in its familiarity. The door slammed behind him. From within, a voice as sharp as shattered glass cut through the roar of the storm. "Out. I said out, Turner. Don't come back." Mr. Hensley, the landlord, stood in the doorway. His tailored suit was untouched by rain, his hair perfectly in place despite the weather, as though storms themselves respected his arrogance. His face, pale under the light, carried a smile not of joy but of satisfaction, the kind a predator wears when it finally corners the weak. "You're 3 months late," Hensley sneered. 3. Do you know how many tenants are lined up for this place? People who actually pay?" Elijah didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line, his dark eyes fixed not on Hensley, but on the ground, where rainwater pooled into a river that carried away scraps of cardboard from his box. His silence was not submission. It was survival. Hensley stepped forward, the polished tips of his shoes gleaming against the wet concrete. He leaned closer, his words slicing through the storm. "Men like you never learn. Always waiting for pity, always pretending life's been unfair. But the truth, Turner, is that you're just lazy. Nothing more." The words dug deep, but Elijah didn't flinch. He had been called worse, by bosses, strangers, even by the quiet doubts in his own head during sleepless nights. He only adjusted his grip on the box and pulled the collar of his jacket tighter, shielding the framed photo inside. His wife, smiling, frozen in a moment before sickness stole her away. The rain grew heavier, blurring the city into streaks of grey and neon. Behind Elijah, the building's windows glowed with warmth, laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of a world that no longer welcomed him. In front of him stretched an alleyway, dark and endless, a throat swallowing him into the unknown. Hensley's voice followed him like a curse. "You don't belong here. You never did." Elijah took one step forward, then another. Each footfall splashed into puddles that swallowed his reflection, fracturing his face into broken pieces. A man unseen, unworthy, at least in the eyes of those who had power. But deep within him, beneath the exhaustion and humiliation, something stirred. It was faint, almost drowned by the storm, yet it pulsed like an ember refusing to die. He felt it in the tightness of his chest, in the sting of memory, in the quiet fury he had buried for years. The storm outside raged. The storm within whispered, "Not yet, but soon." At the far end of the street, headlights appeared. A sleek black car cut through the rain, its engine a low growl beneath the thunder. It slowed as it approached, stopping at the corner where Elijah stood shivering. The tinted window rolled down just enough for a voice, calm, deliberate, to slip into the night. Elijah Turner, it said. Elijah froze. Few people spoke his name with recognition anymore. His fingers tightened on the box as the rain dripped from his brow into his eyes, down his cheeks like tears he refused to shed. The voice continued, lower this time, almost a whisper. It's time. The window rolled up. The car lingered for a moment, its taillights glowing red like twin eyes in the dark, then eased forward, vanishing into the storm. Elijah stood in silence, heart pounding louder than thunder. Hensley's insults still echoed in his ears, but now another sound cut through, the haunting, mysterious words of someone who knew him. It's time. And for the first time in years, Elijah felt the rain not as judgment, but as baptism. The rain did not let up. It poured as though the heavens were determined to wash the city clean, though everyone knew this place was far too stained for redemption. Elijah's shoes squelched with every step, each puddle soaking deeper into the fabric until it felt as though the water had seeped into his very bones. His cardboard box sagged further, the corners bending under the relentless assault of water, his belongings threatening to spill into the gutter. He turned into a narrow alley, away from the glare of the landlord's lights and the echo of cruel laughter that drifted down from open apartment windows. In the shadows, the storm was muffled, but the loneliness was louder. Brick walls pressed in on both sides, graffiti dripping as the rain traced the spray-painted words into rivers of color. He stopped beneath a rusted fire escape, set the box down, and let out a long breath. That felt more like surrender than relief. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of silence. The silence of a man forced to endure insult after insult, year after year, until even his own heartbeat seemed ashamed to echo inside him. Elijah pulled the photograph from the box, wiping droplets from the glass. Her face stared back at him, warm, alive, filled with laughter that had once lit up the darkest corners of his world. His late wife, Miriam. Her smile was a memory that haunted and healed in equal measure. He pressed the photo to his chest, closing his eyes, and for a moment the rain disappeared. He was back in their old kitchen, the scent of cornbread in the oven, her hand resting on his, her voice telling him to hold on, no matter how heavy the world became. A sob rose in his throat, sharp and uninvited, but he crushed it down. Men like him didn't cry where the world could see. Men like him swallowed storms and carried them silently, because no one cared enough to notice. A flash of lightning illuminated the alley, painting his shadow against the brick. Tall, defiant, unbroken. But the thunder that followed seemed to laugh, reminding him of reality. He was a janitor without rent, a man without shelter, a soul without place. And yet, that voice. It's time. Whose voice had it been? He hadn't recognized it immediately, but something about its tone carried a weight that shook him. Calm, deliberate, certain. Not a stranger's voice. Someone who knew him. Someone who had been waiting. Elijah's mind churned with questions, but exhaustion pressed heavier than curiosity. He sank to the wet concrete, leaning against the wall, knees bent, arms folded across his chest. The rain dripped from the fire escape above, plinking against metal in a rhythm that became a cruel lullaby. His thoughts wandered. To the years he had sacrificed, dropping out, of college when his father fell ill, working factory shifts until his back screamed, taking janitorial jobs that others mocked, but which kept food on the table for Miriam and their daughter Alana. To the dreams he buried so deep, even he had forgotten their shapes. To the nights he stared out windows, wondering if the world had already decided who he was meant to be. Invisible, replaceable, disposable. But the car, the voice, it's time. The phrase echoed louder the more he tried to silence it. It curled around his exhaustion, tugged at his despair, and whispered of something he had not felt in years. Possibility. A noise startled him. Footsteps at the far end of the alley, heavy, impatient. He looked up just as a beam of light cut through the rain, a flashlight swaying back and forth. A figure emerged, umbrella tilted low, moving quickly, as though searching for something, or someone. "Elijah Turner?" the figure called, the voice muffled by rain. Elijah froze, his body tensing like a hunted animal. His name again. Twice in one night, after years of being ignored by the world. The footsteps grew closer, splashing through puddles. The figure stopped a few feet away, lowering the umbrella just enough for Elijah to glimpse their face. He couldn't place them, not immediately, but their eyes held recognition. "Elijah," they said softly, almost with reverence. "You don't remember me, do you?" Lightning split the sky again, bathing the alley in white. Elijah stared, heart pounding, his grip tightening on the photograph of Miriam. The stranger leaned closer, rain dripping from their umbrella. Their voice dropped to a whisper, almost lost in the storm. "They've been waiting for you." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the stranger, rain streaking across their face, lit faintly by the glow of a neon sign sputtering at the alley's entrance. The words lingered in the air. "They've been waiting for you." He wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as some cruel trick, another way the night could mock him. But something in the stranger's tone, the steadiness it has, as the gravity, pressed down like truth. Elijah shifted uncomfortably, clutching the photograph tighter against his chest. "You've got the wrong man," Elijah rasped, his voice hoarse from silence and storm. "Nobody waits for me." The stranger tilted their head, almost pitying him. "That's where you're wrong. You've been invisible by choice. But the world, the right people, they never forgot who you are." Elijah's brow furrowed, anger flickering beneath the exhaustion. Invisible by choice? Did this stranger have any idea what it meant to spend decades cleaning the filth of others? To hold a mop while the world walked past as if you were furniture? To swallow humiliation because rent, bills and hunger didn't care about dignity? He pushed himself to his feet, his knees aching, the soaked cardboard box still at his side. "Listen," he said, trying to summon strength in his tone. "I don't know who you are, but I've had enough of riddles. If you've come to laugh, then laugh. If you've come to help, then help. But don't stand here talking like you know me." The stranger didn't flinch. They closed the umbrella and let the rain soak them, as if to match Elijah's suffering. "My name is Daniel," they said simply, "and I was sent to find you." "By who?" Elijah demanded. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice to a murmur only Elijah could hear. "By the people who know what you left behind. By the ones who remember the man you were before you buried yourself in janitor's clothes. Before you chose exile." The words struck like a blow. Exile. The storm outside seemed to pause, waiting on Elijah's reaction. His lips parted, but no words came. Memories surged. A younger version of himself standing in a boardroom, papers spread across a polished table, his ideas sparking fire in the eyes of investors. The ambition, the determination, the sheer force of will he once carried, before it all collapsed under tragedy. He staggered back a step, shaking his head as though to drive the visions away. "That was another life," he muttered. "A mistake." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "No, that was you. The real you. And it's time you stop hiding." The rain hammered louder, cascading from the rooftops, as if demanding Elijah answer. He stood trembling, torn between rage and fear. How could this man know his past? How could anyone remember a dream abandoned so long ago? Before he could speak, movement at the alley's entrance caught his eye. Another figure appeared, taller, broader, framed by the headlights of a car that had pulled up behind him. The shape was unmistakable, even in the storm. Mr. Hensley. The landlord's voice sliced through the night. "Well, well," he sneered, stepping into the alley, rain dripping from his overcoat. "Looks like our janitor has found company. Or maybe accomplices." Elijah's heart sank. The fragile bubble of mystery shattered under Hensley's presence. His arrogance filled the space like poison. "What are you doing here, Turner?" Hensley demanded, his tone laced with suspicion. "Planning to squat? Begging strangers for a couch? You can't even pay rent, and now you think you belong out here in my city?" Daniel stiffened but said nothing. His eyes darted to Elijah, urging him silently. "Stand. Don't shrink." Elijah felt the storm pounding harder than ever, outside and within. His instincts screamed to lower his head, to endure as he always had. But something in Daniel's words, "They've been waiting for you," gnawed at his silence. He looked at Hensley, really looked at him. The sneer, the superiority, the certainty that Elijah was nothing. For the first time, Elijah didn't feel crushed by it. He felt anger. He felt the ember within flare brighter. The storm roared. Elijah opened his mouth, a word rising to his lips. Not an apology, not an excuse, but the beginning of truth. But before he could speak, Daniel placed a firm hand on his arm and whispered, "Not here. Not yet." Lightning split the sky, flooding the alley with blinding light. And in that flash, Elijah saw the reflection of himself in a rain puddle, not broken, not beaten, but waiting for the storm inside him to finally break. The storm had loosened its grip, but the city was far from calm. Rain still fell, softer now, like tears sliding down glass. The alley behind Elijah stretched into silence, Daniel's words echoing in his ears. "They've been waiting for you." He walked, slower now, his box of soaked belongings dragging his arms lower, heavier. Hensley's sneer still stung, but it was not the sharpest wound of the night. What gnawed deeper was the past that Daniel had resurrected. The man Elijah had once been. Not this silent ghost pushing brooms, but someone who had dreamed of more, fought for more, believed he could be more. Every step brought back fragments. The streets blurred into memory. The hiss of wet tires reminded him of late nights driving home to Miriam, when her smile at the doorway erased exhaustion from his bones. The scent of bread from a bakery on the corner tugged him into kitchens filled with his daughter's laughter, a sound so pure he would have scrubbed 1,000 floors just to hear it one more time. But then the memories shifted. Shadows seeped in. Miriam's voice weak with illness, the hospital corridors that smelled of bleach and despair, the bills piling higher than his wages. The day he signed the paperwork, walking away from opportunities that might have changed everything, because family came first, always. He stopped beneath a broken street lamp, the flicker above him sputtering in rhythm with his heartbeat. He set the box down, leaned against the pole, and closed his eyes. The rain on his skin turned to the touch of Miriam's hand on his cheek. He heard her voice again, soft but firm. "Elijah, don't forget who you are." But hadn't he? His fingers shook as he reached into the box and pulled out a crumpled envelope, edges frayed from years of folding. Inside was a letter he had never mailed, written the night Miriam passed, a confession to his daughter Alana, who had long since left the city. He had written of his failures, his regrets, his fear that he was not enough. But the words had never reached her. He had hidden them, just as he had hidden himself. The envelope grew wet in his hand. He slipped it back into the box, ashamed of how much weight it still carried. A car horn blared nearby, startling him back into the present. He looked up and realized he had wandered far from Ashwood Avenue. The buildings here were taller, glossier, their mirrored windows reflecting a man he barely recognized. In the glass, he saw not a janitor, but a stranger, draped in shadows. And yet, deep within that reflection, he glimpsed something familiar. The set of his jaw, the fire in his eyes, dulled but not extinguished. A man who had once walked into these very streets with ambition burning like a torch. Elijah pressed a hand against the cold glass of the nearest building, rain pooling at his feet. He whispered, almost to himself, "Who am I now?" Behind him, footsteps echoed again. Not Daniel's this time. Lighter, quicker, but closing in. Elijah tensed, gripping the edge of his box like a shield. The city had never been kind to vulnerable men at night. "Elijah," a voice called, young, uncertain. He turned. A boy stood at the edge of the sidewalk, no older than 16, hood pulled tight against the drizzle. His eyes were wide, filled with the kind of curiosity that only comes when legends are whispered in secret. "My uncle told me about you," the boy said, stepping closer. "Said you used to be someone. Said you disappeared." The words cut sharper than Hensley's insults. Someone. Used to be. Disappeared. Elijah's throat closed, unable to form a response. The boy shrugged as if disappointed. Guess he was wrong. Then he turned and jogged away, swallowed by the glow of traffic lights. Elijah sent, ood frozen, rain dripping into his eyes, mingling with the salt of shame. For the first time, he wondered if maybe Daniel was right. Maybe he hadn't been forgotten. Maybe his invisibility had been his own doing. And if that was true, the question he feared most returned to haunt him. What if he still had something left to give? The drizzle softened into mist, a veil that blurred the edges of the city. Elijah walked without direction, his shoes heavy, his mind heavier. The boy's words echoed louder than the storm had. Used to be someone. Disappeared. He wanted to deny it, to cling to the illusion that life had given him no choice. But the truth pressed down like the mist. Subtle, suffocating, inescapable. Choices had been made. His choices. He had built walls around himself, brick by brick, until the man inside was no longer seen. The streets carried him toward the old district, a place he hadn't visited in years. The buildings here sagged with time, their paint peeling like skin, their windows dark except for the occasional glow of stubborn tenants refusing to leave. Elijah slowed as he passed a particular storefront, its faded letters just visible through streaks of rain. Turner Co. His breath caught. His name. Still there. Ghostly. Clinging to the facade. The company he had once started with nothing but borrowed cash, wild determination, and Miriam's unwavering faith. They had dreamed of creating something lasting, something that could lift them above survival. And for a while, it had worked. Contracts, clients, meetings filled with possibility. Elijah pressed his palm to the glass. Inside, the space was empty now, gutted, abandoned, only dust where desks once stood. He remembered standing there years ago, watching Miriam bring coffee during late nights, her laughter filling the air, her belief in him stronger than his own. But he also remembered the day it all unraveled, the phone call from the hospital, the collapse of everything else that followed. He had walked away from the company after Miriam's diagnosis, choosing her care over his ambition, and when she was gone, he had nothing left. No company, no money, no strength to rebuild. Only a broom in his hand, and a silence that grew louder with every year. He sank onto the stoop, the box of belongings resting at his side. His fingers rubbed against the photograph of Miriam again, her smile etched into him like scripture. He whispered, "Did I do right, Miriam? Or did I waste everything?" The city gave no answer, only the hiss of tires on wet pavement and the distant hum of sirens. A memory seized him, vivid and merciless. He was back in the hospital, sitting beside her bed, her hand fragile in his. She had looked at him with eyes that still burned with love, whispering, "Promise me you'll live, Elijah. Don't just survive. Live." He had promised. But what had he done with that promise? Buried it under shame. His throat tightened, and he buried his face in his hands. The tears came then, not hidden by rain but flowing freely with it. For once he didn't fight them. They poured out in ragged sobs, shaking his shoulders, wetting his palms. He wept for Miriam, for the dreams lost, for the man he used to be. The mist swirled around him, curling like smoke, blurring the past and present, until they felt inseparable. And then, a sound. "Elijah." He lifted his head, startled. The street was empty, but the voice was unmistakable. Miriam's voice, gentle, insistent, carried on the mist like a ghost. He blinked hard, searching for her, but saw only shadows. Still, the echo of her tone lingered. Not scolding, not pitying, urging. "Elijah, live." His breath shuddered out. Maybe it was grief playing tricks. Maybe it was madness. But the words ignited something in his chest, faint, fragile, but real. He rose to his feet slowly, gripping the box tighter. His reflection in the glass door of Turner Company was clearer now. His eyes no longer looked hollow. They looked hunted, yes, but also alive. The sound of footsteps approached again. Steady, deliberate. He turned sharply. Daniel stood at the corner, half shrouded in fog, watching him with a knowing expression. "You came here," Daniel said softly. "Of all places." Elijah swallowed, his voice low. "I don't know why." Daniel stepped closer. "Yes, you do. Because you're not done. You've been hiding, Elijah, but you still matter. You always did." The words pierced deeper than any insult could. Elijah wanted to deny them, to retreat, but instead he whispered, almost pleading, "Then why does it feel like I lost everything?" Daniel's answer came calm, unwavering. "Because sometimes you have to lose everything, to remember what was yours all along." The mist thickened, curling between them, turning the street into a dreamscape. Elijah stood trembling, Miriam's voice still echoing in his chest, Daniel's words cutting through the fog. And for the first time, he realized he was standing at the threshold of something. Past or future, he didn't know. But the storm within him stirred again. Elijah stood rooted to the spot, the mist curling around his ankles like chains and wings all at once. Daniel's words hung in the air, weighty and unshakable. "You still matter." But a darker voice rose from within him, a voice he had carried for years, quiet but merciless. "You failed. You couldn't save her. You couldn't keep the company alive. You couldn't even keep your daughter close. What kind of man still matters after all that?" He wanted to scream, but only a whisper left his lips. "I don't know how to live anymore." Daniel stepped closer, his gaze steady, unreadable. "That's because you've been surviving, not living. You buried yourself in work that didn't need your heart, because giving your heart meant risking more pain." Elijah turned away, his eyes falling again on the ghostly letters above the storefront, Turner Co., his name fading into nothing. "Maybe this is all I was meant for," he muttered. "A man with a broom. A man nobody remembers. Daniel's voice sharpened. And yet, here I am, remembering. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Elijah's throat tightened, and against his will, memories surged again. He saw Miriam's face, luminous even in sickness. He saw Alana, a child with eyes full of curiosity, watching him leave every morning, clutching her toy rabbit. He remembered the promise he had made to both, to be strong, to be present, to carry them through. And he remembered breaking it when the weight became unbearable. The deepest wound surfaced, the day Alana left. Older now, grown, tired of the silence that had swallowed her father. He had stood at the bus stop watching her board, words locked in his chest, unable to call her back. She had looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with disappointment. And that disappointment had been worse than any insult Hensley could spit. Elijah's knees buckled, and he sank onto the steps again, his chest heaving. "I lost her," he whispered. "My daughter. She doesn't speak to me. She doesn't know me anymore." Daniel crouched beside him, his tone softening. "She doesn't know this version of you. The man who hid. But the man you were. The man you are. She remembers him. And so do others." Elijah shook his head, gripping the photograph of Miriam so tightly the glass frame bit into his palm. "I don't know if I can go back." "Then go forward," Daniel said firmly. The words struck like a hammer, breaking something inside. Elijah lifted his head slowly, his eyes wet with more than rain. "Forward to what?" Daniel's expression shifted, serious now, almost secretive. "There are people waiting. People who haven't forgotten your name, Elijah Turner. People who believe your story isn't finished." The phrase was familiar. "They've been waiting for you." Elijah's heartbeat quickened. The mist felt alive, pressing in around them. "Who are these people?" he demanded, his voice trembling with equal parts fear and hope. Daniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he rose to his feet, offering a hand. "Come and see." Elijah stared at the outstretched hand, his own trembling at his side. Accepting it meant stepping out of the shadows he had lived in for years. It meant risking disappointment again. It meant opening old wounds. But Miriam's voice lingered still. "Live." He placed his hand in Daniel's. The grip was firm, steady, grounding. Daniel pulled him to his feet. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, as if the heavens themselves knew a choice had been made. The street was empty, save for the two of them, the old storefront behind Elijah, his past locked in its dusty corners. Ahead lay only mist and the faint hum of the city that had once cheered his name. Daniel began walking, guiding him forward. Elijah followed, the box of belongings still under his arm, not just junk, but relics of a life both broken and unfinished. They turned a corner, and through the fog, Elijah saw the gleam of glass towers, their lights piercing the night. They stood like giants of ambition, reminders of the man he once tried to become. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. "Tomorrow, you'll stand where you were meant to. And he—" Daniel nodded back toward the shadows where Hensley had lingered earlier. "We'll see who you truly are." Elijah's breath caught. His legs trembled. His heart pounded with dread, and something dangerously close to hope. As the mist parted, the city lights stretched before him, brilliant and merciless, like a stage waiting for its forgotten actor. And Elijah knew the storm within had only just begun. The city never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, its arteries pulsed with restless movement. Car headlights bleeding into puddles, voices spilling from late-night diners, the hum of neon signs buzzing against glass towers. Out for Elijah Turner, the streets felt unnervingly quiet. Every sound seemed to echo louder than it should. The slap of his wet shoes, the creak of his box against his hip, the faint drip of water from the hem of his jacket. Daniel walked a half-step ahead, purposeful but not hurried, as though he already knew the path and the destination. Elijah followed reluctantly, his thoughts a storm far louder than the drizzle overhead. They stopped in front of a building that dwarfed the others around it, a skyscraper of mirrored glass, its entrance framed by marble columns that gleamed even in the rain. The logo above the revolving doors glowed with a cold, corporate shine. Hensley Properties. Elijah froze. The name was like a slap, dragging him back to the landlord's sneer in the alley. His chest tightened, and he whispered through clenched teeth, "Why here? I don't belong here." Daniel turned, his expression unreadable. "You belong more than you think." Elijah shook his head, clutching the box tighter. His reflection in the glass doors mocked him. A drenched janitor, shoes ruined, hair plastered to his forehead, clothes clinging like rags. He looked like an intruder in a palace. "They'll throw me out," he muttered, "just like he did." "Only if you let them," Daniel replied. Before Elijah could protest further, Daniel pushed through the revolving doors. The lobby's light spilled onto the sidewalk, golden and inviting, though Elijah knew better than to trust its warmth. Still, his feet moved forward, one reluctant step at a time, until the glass swallowed him inside. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth. Marble floors polished to mirrors, chandeliers glittering with crystal, walls adorned with artwork that spoke of money more than meaning. People moved with brisk confidence, their shoes clicking like metronomes, their suits sharp enough to cut. And in the middle of it all, Elijah stood dripping, his box sagging, water pooling, at his feet. Eyes turned. Whispered judgments hissed like static. Homeless. Lost. Wrong place. Elijah's shoulders hunched, his throat tightening. He wanted to shrink into the marble, to vanish before the stairs could pierce deeper. But Daniel's hand pressed gently against his back, steadying him. "Keep walking," he murmured. They crossed the lobby toward the elevators. A security guard in a crisp uniform intercepted them, his eyes narrowing at Elijah. "Sir, can I help you?" The tone dripped with suspicion, not an offer of help, but a warning. Daniel met the guard's gaze calmly. "We're expected." The guard's brow furrowed. His eyes flicked back to Elijah, lingering on the mop-worn hands, the soggy box, the janitor's uniform. He opened his mouth to protest, but then stopped. His expression shifted, a flicker of something like recognition darting across his face. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped aside. "Of course. Go ahead." Elijah blinked, startled. Recognition? From this man? He wanted to ask, but Daniel guided him firmly toward the elevator. The golden doors slid open with a hush, swallowing them into a mirrored cage that reflected every angle of Elijah's discomfort. As the doors closed, Elijah leaned back against the wall, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What is happening?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Daniel pressed the button for the top floor, his calmness unshaken. "It's time for you to see the truth, to remember what you left behind." Elijah's pulse pounded. The elevator hummed as it climbed, floor after floor flashing on the panel above. His reflection stared back at him from the polished walls, drenched, tired, small. But beneath the surface, something stirred. That ember again. The doors dinged softly and slid open. Elijah stepped out into a hallway lined with glass walls and soft golden lights. At the far end, a pair of double doors stood tall, carved from mahogany, exuding authority. Daniel gestured toward them. "This is where you begin again." Elijah's legs trembled. His fingers gripped the photograph of Miriam through the soggy box. His throat dried as fear and hope collided inside him. And just as he took a step toward the doors, a voice thundered from behind. "Elijah Turner!" He spun around. The voice was unmistakable. Mr. Hensley. Elijah's chest tightened the moment he heard the name roll off Hensley's tongue. The landlord's voice echoed down the golden hallway, arrogant, sharp, and dripping with contempt. Elijah turned slowly, his box still clutched to his chest, and there he was. Mr. Hensley, dry despite the storm, his tailored suit gleaming under the soft lights. Hensley's lips curled into a thin smirk. I should have known. A janitor sneaking into places he doesn't belong. You've got nerve, Turner. I almost admire it. Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm, measured. He belongs here more than you realize. Hensley's eyes narrowed, his sneer deepening. You again? I don't know who you think you are, bringing this man into my building, but he has no business here. He barely had business in his own apartment. He let out a short laugh, cruel and hollow. The words cut, but Elijah no longer bowed his head. His heart pounded against his ribs, his knees trembled, but his chin lifted, not in defiance but in something close to necessity. He was tired of bending under this man's shadow. I'm not sneaking, Elijah said softly, his voice rough but steady. I was asked to come. Hensley scoffed, his laughter booming down the hall. Asked? By who? The cleaning crew, the pity squad. He gestured at the box in Elijah's arms. Look at you, dripping all over my marble floors. You think anyone here wants you in their offices? Elijah tightened his grip on the photograph inside the box, Miriam's smile grounding him. He felt the burn of humiliation, yes, but also something else rising, a resolve that had been buried too long. Daniel's voice cut through the tension, sharp but controlled. Enough! For the first time, Hensley faltered. He turned toward Daniel, his smirk fading into irritation. And who exactly are you to— The double doors at the end of the hall opened with a soft groan. A woman in a dark suit stepped out, her heels tapping against the polished floor. Her presence was commanding, her gaze sharp as it swept over the scene. Elijah Turner, she said, her voice neither surprised nor uncertain. We've been waiting for you. Elijah froze, the phrase again. We've been waiting for you. It echoed like a drumbeat in his chest, colliding with every doubt, every shame. Hensley turned, his face twisting in confusion. You know him? The woman's eyes flicked to Hensley with disdain, then back to Elijah. Of course. Mr. Turner is expected. Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears. He could hardly breathe. The woman extended a hand, beckoning him toward the doors. Come inside, Mr. Turner. Hensley sputtered, color rising in his cheeks. This is absurd. He's a janitor, a tenant I evicted tonight. He doesn't belong here. The woman's expression hardened, her tone cutting. And yet he owns more of this building than you ever will. The words struck like lightning. Silence filled the hall. Elijah's knees nearly buckled. His mind reeled. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny, but no sound came. He stood trembling, staring at the woman, then at Daniel, then back at Hensley's stunned face. What? Hensley hissed, his voice cracking. What did you just say? But the woman didn't answer him. She stepped aside, holding the door open for Elijah. Please, we've waited long enough. Elijah looked down at the photograph of Miriam, the corners of the frame pressing into his palm. He heard her voice again, urging him, Live. His feet moved before his doubts could stop him. One stay. Epa. Then another. Past Hensley's stunned glare, past the life of humiliation he had carried, toward the doors that glowed like the entrance to another life. Daniel's hand brushed his shoulder briefly as he passed. This is your invitation. Elijah crossed the threshold. The doors closed behind him with a heavy finality, muffling Hensley's protests into silence. And inside, under the golden light of the boardroom, his new beginning waited. The boardroom stretched out like a throne room of glass and light. A long mahogany table gleamed under the glow of recessed lamps, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline, jeweled with rain-blurred lights. Elijah hesitated at the threshold, water dripping from his jacket, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Several figures sat around the table, their faces turned toward him, not disdainful, not mocking, expectant. A reverent silence hung in the air, broken only by the steady patter of rain against the windows. The woman who had welcomed him motioned to an empty chair at the head of the table. "Mr. Turner, please?" "Sit." Elijah's throat went dry. He looked at Daniel, who gave him a small nod. His hands trembled as he set the soggy box down by the door, clutching only the photograph of Miriam as though it were armor. Slowly, cautiously, he walked to the chair and lowered himself into it. The weight of the room pressed on him. He could feel the eyes of every person studying him, not with ridicule but with recognition, and that, somehow, was harder to bear. The woman took her seat beside him. "Do you know why you're here?" Elijah shook his head, his voice breaking. I don't. I shouldn't be here." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You should. Because this is yours." She slid a folder across the table. The papers inside bore his name in bold letters. Elijah Turner, majority shareholder. The world tilted. Elijah blinked, his chest tightening as the words burned into his mind. This has to be a mistake." "It isn't," Daniel said quietly for, "On the corner." The woman's voice softened, but it carried authority. "Mr. Turner, when you founded Turner County, you didn't just create a small business. You created something bigger. You invested wisely. You left a legacy that grew in silence while you grieved. These holdings, these shares, they've been accumulating, waiting." Elijah's hands shook as he lifted the papers. His name leapt out at him over and over, tied to contracts, properties, dividends. Wealth that had been building quietly, like a seed planted long ago finally breaking the earth. "I walked away," he whispered, eyes stinging. "I left it all behind." "And yet," the woman said gently, "it never left you. The world may have overlooked you, but your work, your choices, your sacrifices, they grew roots." Elijah's chest swelled with emotions he could not name. Awe, fear, guilt, a flicker of hope. Hensley's voice clawed into his memory. "You don't belong here." But these papers, this room, these people, they told a different story. He lifted the photograph of Miriam, pressing it to the table beside the folder. "I did it for her," he murmured. "I gave everything for her." "And she would be proud," Daniel said, his voice steady. Elijah closed his eyes. He could almost hear her laugh, see her eyes shining. For the first time in years, the memory didn't feel like a knife. It felt like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. When he opened his eyes, he found every face at the table still turned toward him, waiting. The silence was thick, filled with unspoken questions. Would he accept this? Would he step into what was rightfully his? His lips parted, words trembling on the edge. I don't know if I can carry this." The woman leaned closer, her gaze fierce but kind. "Mr. Turner, you already have. You carried it through storms, through loss, through years of silence. The only question now is, will you carry it forward?" The boardroom seemed to blur around him, the lights bending, the rain beyond the windows turning into streaks of memory and possibility. Elijah Turner, janitor, outcast, invisible. And yet also Elijah Turner, builder, dreamer, heir to something larger than he had ever imagined. His hand clenched around Miriam's photograph. His voice, though shaky, broke the silence. "Show me everything." The woman's smile widened, not triumphant but relieved, as though she had been waiting for this moment as long as he had. And in that instant, Elijah felt it, the ember within him sparking into flame. The invitation had been given. Now the storm inside him would decide what to do with it. The next morning, the city woke under a bruised sky. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered. Gutters overflowing, streets slick with last night's rage, and the smell of rain clinging to the air like smoke after a fire. Elijah sat alone in a high-rise office, the folder still open before him, his name stamped across every page. The night had been a blur. Hours spent with Daniel and the board, explanations tumbling one after another, each one heavier than the last. He hadn't dreamed this fortune into existence. It had grown quietly, roots spreading beneath the surface of the world, until it became undeniable. He wasn't just connected to these towers, he owned them. And yet, as dawn painted the skyline grey, Elijah felt the weight not as triumph, but as burden. His hands trembled as he traced his name with a finger, whispering to himself, "What am I supposed to do with this?" The door swung open. Daniel entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Elijah and studied him. "You didn't sleep." Elijah let out a humorless chuckle. "Would you?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply pulled out a chair and sat, leaning forward. "You need to understand. The world has already decided you matter. Now you need to decide if you believe it." Before Elijah could reply, the office door burst open again. This time, Hensley stormed in, his face flushed, his eyes wild with indignation. 2 security guards flanked him, uneasy but compliant, clearly aware of his usual power in this building. "There he is," Hensley barked, pointing at Elijah. "That's the man I threw out on the street yesterday. And you're telling me he's supposed to own this place?" His laugh was harsh, ugly, scraping against the walls. "This is madness, a trick, a mistake." Elijah stiffened, every muscle in his body tightening. He rose slowly from his chair, the folder still on the desk behind him, his hands curling at his sides. His instinct was to lower his head, to retreat, but something in him refused. Daniel's calm voice broke the tension. "Mr. Hensley, you should be careful. You're speaking to the majority shareholder of this building." The words struck like a whip. The guard's eyes widened, flicking from Hensley to Elijah. For the first time, they hesitated. Hensley turned, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "What did you say?" Daniel repeated it, slower this time. "Elijah Turner owns more of this building than you do. More than anyone else in this room." Hensley's mouth opened, then closed, his fists clenched. "Impossible," he spat. "This man is a nobody, a janitor. Look at him." Elijah's chest rose and fell with the weight of every insult, every humiliation that had ever been hurled his way. He wanted to shout, to tear into Hensley with the fury of years buried. But instead, he stepped forward, his voice low, steady, and sharper than thunder. "You've looked at me 100 times," he said, "but you've never seen me. Not once." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the guards seemed frozen, caught between the world they knew and the truth unfolding before their eyes. Hensley's face twisted into a sneer. "You think money changes who you are? You're still the same man I threw into the Raoult. Nothing will change that." Elijah took another step forward, closing the space between them. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're right," he said. "Money doesn't change who I am, but it shows who you are." The words struck harder than a shout. Hensley flinched, just slightly, but enough for Elijah to see the crack in his armor. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable.
The guards shifted uncomfortably. The air in the office was thick, trembling with unspoken truths. And Elijah knew this was only the beginning. Hensley's face darkened, his jaw tight as a vice. He took a step closer, lowering his voice into a hiss meant to cut deeper than his shouts. "You think this is your world now, Turner? You think you can walk in here dripping rainwater and dirt and suddenly erase what you are? You've lived beneath men like me your whole life, and that's where you belong." Elijah felt the sting of the words, sharp as broken glass. A part of him wanted to recoil, to retreat into the silence that had shielded him for years. But another part, the part that had been stirring since the storm, the part that remembered Miriam's voice and Alana's gaze, held him upright. He drew a breath, slow and steady, and replied, "I've lived beneath no man. I've lived beneath grief, beneath sacrifice, beneath the weight of doing what had to be done when no one else would." Hensley's sneer faltered, if only for a heartbeat. Elijah pressed forward. "You see a janitor because that's all you're capable of seeing. You think sweeping floors makes a man small. But I've learned that dignity doesn't come from what you hold in your hands. It comes from what you carry in your heart." The guards exchanged glances. Even Daniel leaned forward, his expression sharpened, as though he too felt the shift in the air. Hensley scoffed, louder now, masking his unease with cruelty. "Fine words from a man who can't even pay rent. Tell me, Turner, if you're so important, why did you end up mopping my hallways? Why did you crawl through gutters for pennies?" The question seemed but deep. Elijah's chest tightened with shame, memories flooding back, nights working 2 shifts, hands raw and blistered, hiding from his daughter the depth of their poverty. But he didn't flinch. Not this time. "Because I chose love over ambition," Elijah said quietly. His voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Because when my wife was dying, I decided being beside her mattered more than contracts or money. I traded boardrooms for hospital rooms, profits for prayer. And when she was gone, I had nothing left but a mop and the promise I made her. To keep living, even if I didn't know how." The room fell into silence. Even the rain beyond the windows seemed to pause, listening. Elijah's eyes burned, but he held Hensley's gaze. "You think that makes me weak? No. It makes me strong in ways you'll never understand. Because strength isn't measured by how many people you crush beneath your feet. It's measured by how many storms you survive without losing yourself." For the first time, Hensley's mask slipped. His sneer faded into something uglier. Fear. "You're nothing," Hensley muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You always will be." Elijah stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried more force than any shout. "And yet, here I stand, in the building that carries my name, while you, Mr. Hensley, tremble because the truth has finally found you." The words landed like a blow. Hensley stumbled back a step, color draining from his face. Daniel rose from his chair, his presence commanding. "This is your reckoning, Hensley. The man you mocked, the man you cast out into the storm, is the man who owns the very ground you walk on." The guards straightened, their loyalty shifting with the wind of power. Their eyes no longer lingered on Elijah with suspicion, but on Hensley with doubt. Hensley's breath came fast. Now. He looked around the room, desperate for control. "You can't do this," he spat. "You don't belong here, Turner, you don't—" The office door opened again. The woman from the boardroom stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply. She glanced at Elijah, then at Hensley,
her gaze icy. "Mr. Turner does belong here," she said firmly. "And from this moment forward, his authority outweighs yours in every way." Hensley's face contorted, rage and disbelief colliding. His voice cracked as he roared, "This isn't over!" Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. He simply whispered back, "It already is." The words hung in the air like a verdict, final and unshakable. The silence that followed Elijah's words was thicker than the storm had ever been. The boardroom walls seemed to close in, the golden lights casting sharp shadows across Hensley's face. His mouth opened and closed like a man drowning in air, but no words could disguise the tremor in his voice or the fear beginning to seep through his arrogance. Elijah stood tall, though his knees trembled beneath him. He had spent decades bowed under shame, but at this moment he refused to bend. The photograph of Miriam rested on the desk beside the folder, her smile steadying him, her voice echoing inside. "Live." Daniel moved closer, his presence calm but commanding. "Mr. Hensley," he said evenly, "your time lording over others is finished. Mr. Turner's stake in this building, in this company, gives him the authority to strip you of power if he so chooses." The board members murmured, their whispers a tide Hensley could not silence. His face twisted, rage and desperation warring. "You can't listen to him," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Elijah. "He's a fraud. He's nothing but a janitor who—" Elijah raised a hand, not to strike, not to shout, but simply to stop the noise. His voice, low but steady, cut through the chaos like a blade. "Enough." The room stilled. Even Hensley froze, his breath ragged. Elijah stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the faces around the tables, before settling on Hensley. "You see a janitor," he said softly, "but I see a man who survived what you couldn't imagine. I scrubbed floors because I refused to starve. I carried trash because I refused to abandon my family. And in doing so, I learned that dignity doesn't come from wealth, but from endurance. You mocked me for what you thought was weakness, but that weakness was strength all along." Hensley's eyes darted wildly, searching for allies. But the board members avoided his gaze, their silence damning. Elijah continued, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. "This building doesn't belong to arrogance. It doesn't belong to cruelty. It belongs to the people who understand what it means to work, to sacrifice, to endure. And I will never again let you treat another human being the way you treated me." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain against the glass, softer now, as if the storm itself had quieted to listen. Then the woman from the boardroom spoke, her tone decisive. "Effective immediately, Mr. Hensley, your authority here is revoked. The board recognizes Mr. Turner as the rightful majority shareholder and acting voice of this institution." The words hit Hensley like a hammer. His face flushed crimson, his hands shaking. He sputtered, rage spilling in incoherent fragments. You can't... I built..." But Elijah stepped closer, his eyes locked on the man who had thrown him into the storm. His voice was quiet, almost tender, but unyielding. "You built nothing but fear, and fear has no foundation. It crumbles the moment truth touches it." Hensley's lips quivered. For the first time, the man looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable. Small. Security moved toward him, their steps firm. He backed away, sputtering threats that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "This isn't over! You'll regret this! You'll—" The doors closed behind him with a sharp click. Silence fell again, heavy, but liberating. Elijah exhaled, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of years had finally shifted. He turned to the board, his voice softer now. "I don't want vengeance. I want change. No one else should endure what I endured. Not here. Not in my buildings. Not under my name. The board members exchanged glances, surprised but not resistant. Daniel smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. Elijah glanced down at Miriam's photograph, his hand brushing over the frame. He whispered so quietly only he could hear, "We're not done, Miriam, not yet." The storm outside eased into a drizzle, the first hint of dawn breaking through the clouds. The city beyond the glass glowed faintly, as though the night itself had surrendered to a new light. And Elijah Turner stood at its center, no longer invisible, no longer bowed, but ready for what came next. The city was waking. Dawn broke like a bruise fading into gold, streaks of light pushing through the grey horizon. The rain had finally ceased, leaving streets glistening as though the storm had scrubbed them clean. For the first time in years, Elijah Turner did not feel the weight of invisibility pressing him down. He walked through the glass tower's lobby with Daniel at his side, every eye turning toward him, not with ridicule, but with recognition. The whispers followed. "That's him. Mr. Turner. The owner." The same polished marble that had reflected his soaked shame the night before now mirrored something different. A man standing taller, shoulders squared, gaze steady. He carried no mop, no bucket, no tools of invisibility. Only himself. And for once, it was enough. Yet as the revolving doors released him onto the street, Elijah stopped. The city stretched before him, alive and relentless, but his heart tugged backward. To the storm, to the rain-soaked night when he had been cast out with nothing but a box and a photograph. That moment, raw and humiliating, had shaped the one unfolding now. Without it, he might never so have stepped into the light. Daniel watched him pause. "What are you thinking?" Elijah's eyes drifted to the sky, pale with morning. "That last night I was nothing but a shadow. Today the city looks at me, but I can't forget the man in the rain. The janitor. He's as much me as this." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. "Then carry him with you, because he's the reason you'll never become what Hensley was." Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile, weary but real. "You're right." They walked together down the steps, and the chill air carried memories like whispers. Every corner reminded Elijah of something. The bakery where Miriam had bought bread, the bus stop where Alana once waved goodbye, the alleys that had swallowed his solitude. All of it still lived here, etched into the bones of the city. But as they turned the corner, Elijah froze. Across the street, standing in the thin light of dawn, was Hensley. His immaculate suit was disheveled now, his hair damp, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless fury. He looked smaller than Elijah had ever seen him, swallowed by the morning. Their eyes locked. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. Hensley's lip curled, but the usual venom was missing. His voice, when it came, was brittle. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Men like you'll always crawl back to the gutter." Elijah studied him, the man who had thrown him into the storm, the man who had mocked his pain, stripped him of shelter, and laughed at his silence. For years Elijah would have shrunk under those words, but not now, not anymore. He stepped off the curb, crossing the street slowly, deliberately, until he stood a few feet from Hensley. The morning traffic roared around them, but it felt as though the world itself had hushed. "I don't need to enjoy it," Elijah said quietly, "because this isn't about wealth. It's about dignity, something you've never understood." Hensley's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed the truth: fear, resentment, and something even darker: envy. Elijah's voice softened. "You thought you destroyed me last night. You thought the rain would wash me away, but storms don't break men like me. They baptize us." The words lingered, heavier than thunder. Hensley's gaze faltered. His lips parted, but no response came. Daniel called from across the street, his voice steady. "Elijah, it's time." Elijah looked once more at Hensley, the man who had defined his shame for too long. And then, with a calmness that startled even himself, he said, "I forgive you." Hensley flinched as though struck. His face contorted, torn between rage and disbelief. Forgiveness was the last weapon he expected. Elijah turned away, stepping back toward the sidewalk where Daniel waited. The rising sun caught his silhouette, casting him not as a shadow, but as a figure of light against the fading storm. And as he walked forward, the city seemed to shift, not just because a millionaire had been revealed, but because a man had reclaimed himself. The boardroom was filled to capacity. Executives, assistants, and shareholders crowded into the glass chamber high above the city, their conversations a low, restless murmur. Everyone had heard the rumors. The janitor turned millionaire, the silent shareholder stepping into the light. Elijah stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his hands resting against its polished surface. The skyline behind him glowed with the soft blaze of morning, golden light spilling into the room as though it too had come to witness. Daniel stood quietly near the door, arms folded, watching with a steady gaze. The murmurs hushed as Elijah straightened. He took a breath, his heart thundering in his chest. For years, silence had been his language. Today, it had to be his voice. "I know what you see when you look at me," Elijah began, his voice low but carrying across the room. "A man who has spent more time with a mop than with a pen. A man who worked in shadows, who seemed to vanish at times into corners. To some of you, I've been invisible, disposable." A ripple of discomfort stirred among the listeners. No one met his eyes. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "But let me tell you what you don't see. You don't see the nights I chose work over sleep because my family needed food. You don't see the years I buried ambition because my wife's life mattered more than my pride. You don't see the storms I endured when grief was the only thing left in my pockets." He paused, his breath trembling, the photograph of Miriam in his jacket pocket pressing against his heart like an anchor. "And yet," he continued softer now, "those years didn't break me. They taught me. They taught me that every person matters, no matter how the world labels them. That dignity cannot be erased by a paycheck or mocked by arrogance. That the man sweeping your floors carries stories, sacrifices, and strength you may never understand." Faces lifted toward him now, some softened by guilt, others sharpened by respect. Elijah's eyes swept across them all, steady, unflinching. "I stand before you, not as a janitor, not as a millionaire, but as a man who knows what it is to be invisible. And I will not let this company, my company, treat another human being the way I was treated. Not the tenants, not the workers, not anyone who passes through these doors." A quiet power filled the room, the kind that no wealth could buy. Daniel's expression softened, pride glinting in his eyes. Elijah straightened fully, his voice ringing firm. "From this day forward, this building, these properties, this name, they will stand for dignity, for respect, for seeing people not as tools or obstacles, but as lives worth honoring. That is the legacy I claim. That is the legacy I demand we uphold." Silence fell, not the silence of dismissal, but of weight, of impact. The storm outside had dead, but inside, a new current hummed, one of possibility. Finally, the woman from the boardroom rose to her feet. Her voice carried a quiet reverence. "Mr. Turner, we are ready to follow that vision." Others nodded, murmuring assent. The tide had shifted, and it was irreversible. At the far end of the table, Hensley sat in a corner chair, his face pale, His eyes burning with rage he could no longer wield as power. He opened his mouth to speak, but no one turned to listen. His voice had been drowned out, replaced by Elijah's. Elijah glanced at him only once, not with triumph, but with something gentler, mercy. Then he looked away, refusing to let Hensley define this moment. He placed both hands on the table, the sunlight catching the lines of his weary palms. Then let's begin. The room erupted into quiet applause, hesitant at first, then building, not out of ceremony, but out of something deeper. Recognition, respect. Elijah bowed his head slightly, his throat tight. For the first time in years, he felt Miriam's promise fulfilled. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. That evening, as the city settled under a silver twilight, Elijah stepped outside the tower that now bore his name in truth as well as paper. The boardroom had emptied, Daniel had gone, and the applause had faded into memory. The streets glistened again, a soft drizzle falling from the heavens. Not a storm this time, but a cleansing rain. Elijah tilted his face upward, letting the droplets strike his skin. The rain no longer felt like condemnation. It felt like blessing. He carried no box this time, no mop, no sign of invisibility. Only himself, shoulders squared, heart steady. Yet tucked safely in his pocket was Miriam's photograph, warmed by the heat of his chest. She had walked every step with him, through grief, through humiliation, through revelation. He wandered the streets without hurry. Every storefront, every corner held echoes of his past. The bakery where he once scraped coins for bread, the bus stop where Alana's small hand once waved, the alley where he had been thrown into the storm. Each memory hurt, but none crushed him. They had shaped him, and now they bowed before him like scars turned into scripture. At the corner of Ashwood Avenue he stopped. The same spot where Hensley's voice had spat venom, where rain had soaked him to the bone, where headlights had revealed the words that changed everything. It's time. Elijah closed his eyes. The drizzle clung to his lashes, dripping like tears. He could almost hear Miriam's voice again, clear and insistent. Live. His lips parted, and he whispered back to the sky. I am. A soft smile touched his face, trembling but true. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The city hummed around him, alive and relentless. But he stood tall within it, no longer invisible, no longer bowed. Across the street, a young boy paused, staring at him curiously. The same boy from the other night, the one who had said he used to be someone. Elijah caught his gaze and offered a small nod, steady and sure. The boy's eyes widened with something new, respect, before he darted away into the glow of the city. Elijah turned back toward the tower, its windows blazing against the dusk. This was no fairy tale. The city was still hard, still cold, still merciless. But for the first time, Elijah knew he had the strength and the authority to change even a piece of it, to honor the unseen, the unheard, the forgotten. The drizzle thickened, soaking his jacket, tracing lines down his cheeks. But Elijah didn't flinch. He spread his arms slightly, as though embracing the storm, whispering into the rain, "This is my baptism." The city lights blurred through the mist, glowing like lanterns of redemption. He thought of Alana, wherever she was, and prayed that one day she would see him not as the broken man she left behind, but as the man he had become, a father reborn. And with that thought, Elijah turned and walked down the street, his silhouette framed by rain and neon. He walked not as a janitor, not as a millionaire, but as both, a man whole again. The drizzle softened. the clouds parting just enough for a single star to pierce through the night sky. Elijah glanced up, the faintest laugh escaping his lips. Miriam was there, not in body, but in spirit, shining through the break in the clouds. "Thank you," he whispered. The rain fell slower now, gentler, like a curtain drawing closed, and Elijah Turner walked forward, his story carried by the rhythm of water, the hum of the city, and the truth that storms cannot destroy what was meant to rise. And in the hush between raindrops, the city seemed to whisper the question Elijah had already answered. What if the man you ignored was the one you needed most?